Governments come and go, but the practices of the religion, if they are kept intact, guarantee the future of that civilization. What really counts in a civilization is its heart, and the heart of the Islamic world is miraculously intact. The whole Ummah is attached to Ghazali. It's such an encyclopedic work, the Ihya Ulumuddin. It's very interesting to see how somebody who was writing 900 years ago in a very different place still grabs people's attention and turns them around and makes them better people in such a different world. It's not the kind of Islamic institution where people go in order to be safe from the challenges of the modern world. It's rather the opposite. We say, what about evolution? What about the Big Bang? What about artificial intelligence? You have to think about or be exposed to what Muslims are thinking about these issues. Otherwise, you're just going to be a kind of refugee hiding from modern challenges that people are asking about.
Ketebe'nin katkılarıyla hazırlanan Düşünce Atlası başlıyor.
Abdulhakim, would you mind briefly telling us, to our audience, who is Abdulhakim Winter?
Well, perhaps by the end of my life on this earth I may learn the answer to that. The self is a strange series of images that we hold up to ourselves and others do the same. But of course, İnsan bir muammadır, as they say. We're a riddle to ourselves even. In terms of the outward curriculum vitae, one would say school, Cambridge University, 6 years studying in the Middle East after I became Muslim, and then PhD from University of Amsterdam in philosophy of religion. I've been holding down for 20 years now a job as lecturer in Islamic studies at the University of Cambridge in the Divinity School. I publish on a range of issues, philosophy of religion, sometimes comparative religion, a few things related to Ottoman literature, but I'm still working on that. And then I'm the dean of this place, which is the Cambridge Müslüman College, which has been going for about 10 years. Which is like İlahiyat Fakültesi, it's like a sort of divinity school. We have 62 full-time students and an accredited degree, and we're basically aiming to increase the intellectual discourse of the Muslims in the British community, using the English language as the means of communication, and the focus is very much on what used to be called the ma'kulat, that is to say, kalam, logic, philosophy, and particularly drawing in the philosophies of the British philosophical tradition, and it's very much focused on its relationality to the current intellectual reality in the West. And Cambridge, of course, a city of very many great British philosophers, continental philosophers. Wittgenstein was here, for instance. And so we're a kind of training ground for what we hope will be the intellectual leadership of the Anglophone Ummah in coming years. And otherwise, wife, 3 children, 1 car, 1 house. Nothing very interesting to report. Well, the whole Ummah is attached to Ghazali. Imam Nawawi says if all of the books of Islam were to be lost and only the Ihya remained, it would be enough. It's such an encyclopedic work, the Ihya Ulumuddin, that it became clear that of all of the hundreds of thousands of classics in the Muslim libraries around the world, this was very high on the list of texts that really needed to be made available to the English reader, to the Muslim and the non-Muslim reader as well. Ghazali is one of the great thinkers of the world, really, not just of the Islamic world. And so there's a project to translate the whole Ihya, all 40 volumes, into English, which is based at the Islamic Text Society, which is here in Cambridge. And I've done 3 of the 40 books, so if I do all of them, probably in about 200 years I'll finish the whole project. Academics work slowly. But we also have something called the Travelling Light series, which is my project for filming 40 lectures based on the 40 books of the Ihya in different venues around the world. So we have been to great mosques in Senegal, in Spain. Most recently we came back from Qasr-e-Arifan, which is the village near Bukhara in Uzbekistan, where Imam Shah Baha'u'ddin Naqshband is buried, so we're very happy to be able to record the lectures at the tekke there. We have recorded lectures at the old Selçuklu Ulu Cami in Konya, next to the famous minbar where Mevlana used to read his khutbahs. We were sitting there and giving two of the lectures there. Also the Yeni Kapı Mevlevi Hanesi, we gave 2 lectures there, and a small tekke, Mevlevi tekke, in Bursa. So the idea is that we introduce the world, which is now really not a world of books. Who is going to buy a 40-volume classical text? A few academics perhaps. And the book deserves very wide exposure. We decided to adopt this HD video approach, using sort of very sophisticated recording techniques, but also documenting something of the physical beauty, the built heritage, and also the oral heritage. So we recorded in Turkey a number of ilahis, also great ilahis which we found in Senegal, the traditional singing of the Spanish Muslims in Spain, the Moriscos. We were able to record 8 very interesting songs. We released a CD so people can hear the sound of Muslim Spain and the language they used. That was a very interesting archaeological exercise. And then in Bukhara we found some really amazing vocalists, and we recorded songs in Uzbek and in Farsi, including some from the Divani Hikmet of Khaja Ahmed Yasavi, who of course is buried in very close to Uzbekistan. So it's ramified into a major project that we use to raise funds. It's a charitable exercise. As well as exposing people to the wisdom of Imam al-Ghazali, we expose them to the diversity and the beauty of the heritage of so many corners of the Muslim world, including places that they haven't heard of before. And not just the Muslim world. So we recorded 2 episodes in Iceland, for instance. A little tekke in the mountains north of Reykjavik with a local audience, and we had some Icelandic nasheed singers, very beautiful Icelandic ilahis based on the old sort of saga sonorities. So it's been a very interesting journey, and so that's been my main focus in terms of serving the legacy of Imam al-Ghazali. And it's very impressive to see how many people are downloading these products and how many people are profoundly influenced, including in the prisons, because in UK prisons inmates are not allowed to access the internet, and many of them don't read terribly well, but they allowed DVDs. So we have a set of these DVDs in about 80 British prisons, and the prisoners sitting there, Muslims and non-Muslim, learning from the wisdom of Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. It's very interesting to see how somebody who was writing 900 years ago in a very different place still grabs people's attention and turns them around and makes them better people in such a different world. Well, the modern world is not a single thing. Each educational group, each vocational group, each ethnicity, each country has its own issues. Globalization is a superficial thing. The reality is that the British soul is still very different from the French soul, for instance. The Japanese are very distinct. So what Islam offers to each of these shu'ub wa qaba'il, each of these nations, is going to be something distinctive. What we find is effective in the Anglophone world tends to be the writings of Western Muslim scholars. Henry Bayman is very influential here. Shamsuddin Friedlander, who perhaps you knew, who died in Istanbul recently. Charles Upton, the American Muslim writer. They tend to have quite a strong impact because they're from the West. They understand the questions Westerners are asking, which are very often very different to the questions that people are asking in the Middle East or Indonesia. Sometimes people from those zones find that our intellectual output is interesting to them because, in a sense, the Anglosphere controls the mindset of the elite through Hollywood, literature, Booker Prize and so forth. English is the first truly global imperial language. But the specifics of what people are looking for now is, the main issues I would say are that are worrying young people because it's a very anxious generation. Climate change, probably top of the list. The singularity, the overcoming of the man-machine distinction through artificial intelligence, genetic manipulation, very major concern. Gender fluidity. And all of these issues really are relatively new, you could say, and it's very difficult to look them up in the books of Imam al-Ghazali or Book of Classical Fiqh because they're technologically enabled or precipitated. But it's an anxious age, an unhappy age, and I think that if Islam is to progress and show its therapeutic usefulness, it has to develop a voice and a theology that focuses primarily on those issues rather than the issues that are preoccupying people in Pakistan, Morocco or wherever, where generally those 3 issues I mentioned are not top of the list. So the West has its own specific problems and specific capacities, and one of the things we're doing here at the Cambridge Muslim College is to develop theologies and fiqh interpretations that orient our Islam towards generating a set of solutions that immediately address the questions people are asking. rather than the questions that Muslims would like them to ask. So climate change is an important one, the singularity, the nature of consciousness, all of these have to be at the forefront of an Islamic attempt to justify the religion's usefulness as opposed to simple kind of tolerability in the very complex situation that we find ourselves in. Well, there are classical methodologies that may no longer be very easy to implement. One of them, of course, is to speak to people who are on a spiritual rather than an ethical quest. People who have been touched by God, who have had experiences, who have a particular love of transcendence, who intuit the reality that lies behind the forms of beauty and nature. There are, in my experience, a lot of spiritual seekers like that in our culture, people on a vision quest. And historically, one would just point them in the direction of the nearest pir or murshid or tariqat. In modern Britain, it's rather difficult to do that. The community's preoccupations are by and large not spiritual, but oriented towards the survival of sometimes economically precarious ethnic minorities, and the depth as opposed to the formal amplitude of the religion is not particularly easy for people to access. But nonetheless, human beings are naturally religious. People are constantly asking the big questions. People are constantly touched by an experience of transcendence. I'm not sure that our community as yet is sufficiently geared up to handling people who want to fall in love with God, rather than just to understand our books of theology. That, I think, is the next major challenge. Well, tradition is a complex term. Of course, modernity exists primarily as a rebellion against tradition. Until 200 years ago, human beings almost all thought that the golden age was in the past. With the Enlightenment and modernity, we're told that there is such a thing as progress. We're getting better, we're getting happier, and the golden age is in the future, which is a complete inversion of how human beings for 100,000 years saw themselves. So therefore tradition is problematized by modernity almost by definition. However, the advantage of tradition is that it gives people something that we know that they crave, which is a sense of identity and a set of coordinates in the middle of a rapidly changing and very confusing world. We have all manner of mental health epidemics now in Britain. We also have social fragmentation. There's a minister of loneliness now in the British government, because the National Health Service identifies over 9 million people in the country who are suffering from clinically significant degrees of loneliness as individualism bites. People live alone, old people are abandoned, single mothers. It's the ideology of individualism purports to be liberative, but inevitably it generates a kind of atomized, fragmented society that is now producing very severe clinical outcomes. So one thing that people have needed since the earliest times in the Upper Paleolithic is telling the stories of the tribe. What did we do 100,000 years before the internet, before books? We sat around the campsite and we recited our genealogies, or we told about the sagas and the great fights of our ancestors, or we named our horses, and that's what human culture was. So tradition is something that we really need in order to help us to make sense of the world. And since that is being problematized by modernity, people feel that they're a little bit naked, a little bit exposed, a little bit unsure of what the coordinates are. And again, that leads to many very negative impacts on people's sense of well-being. The question for Muslims, of course, or for Islam generally in the Western environment is if local traditions are dying away, British people no longer read their literature, they no longer have homes that look British. British cars look like cars from anywhere. It's quite unlike what it was, say, 30 or 40 years ago. Globalization has greyed everything. What is the Islamic contribution when Islam is not a substrate of local identity? How can Islam help people with their sense of identity when it doesn't seem to form part of their heritage? So one of the things that we find people in the British Muslim community doing now is linking the cultural forms of the religion as opposed to the ritual forms, which are immutable, to aspects of British heritage. So the design of mosques using a British idiom, the sound of British ilahis and songs using British tunes rather than Bangladeshi tunes or Arab tunes, the increasing use of the English language in the ritual forms of the religion is a way of allowing Islam to populate their past as well as their present. So the zikr that we do here in the college every Thursday is a mixture of things Arabic and in Turkish and in English, It takes about half an hour and it's very basic, but the tunes are English rather than Middle Eastern or Oriental. It's not Eastern maqams, it's not maqam Segah, maqam Hijaz and so forth, because that's not our tradition or our identity. Instead, it's traditional English tunes. And we find that a very interesting way of demonstrating the religion's universalism in inhabiting these very local particularities in ways that give voice to 100% Islamic sentiments. The climate crisis is not caused by any of the world's religions. It's caused by modernity and materialism. Humanity lived in a sustainable balance with nature in traditional China, traditional India, traditional Turkey, until modernity started to make human beings not just one part of a balanced ecosystem, but as a predatory and disruptive principle that upset the balance of nature, which started with the Industrial Revolution, with the Enlightenment, with the instrumentalizing of matter, the natural world, mass agriculture. So it's the consequence of a certain mixture of cleverness and foolishness which characterizes the materialistic mindset. So any return to a sacred tradition necessarily is essential if this is to be resolved. You can't deal with a catastrophe caused by modernity with a modern solution. It has to be a solution that relates to normal human patterns of engaging with the natural world, rooted in the idea that the natural world is a finite resource but is also sacred. And those Quranic verses that speak about the tasbih, the praises given by the birds and the animals, different orders of creation, indicate to me the way forward, which is that we need to re-sacralize the natural world if we are to prevent human beings from exercising their greed to destroy it. So we find that really across the Islamic world today, we find many Muslim countries are at the forefront of resisting climate change. Morocco, for instance, is globally joint first with Sweden in terms of the amount of wind and solar power that it uses. Morocco is beginning to export energy to the UK via an underwater cable because they have plenty of sunshine. Turkey is also very good. Perhaps you know that the Galatasaray Stadium is the world's greenest stadium because the roof is covered in photovoltaic cells. Southeastern Turkey, the Black Sea coast, they're using a lot of wind turbines now.
And Çanakkale as well.
Yep. And also Turkey is opening this year its first nuclear power station, which is also something that reduces the consumption of fossil fuels. So there's plenty of good examples of good practice in the Muslim world, and we need to be encouraging that. One of the things that we stress in our Cambridge Muslim community is the fact that all of that needs to be backed by a sound theology, rather than just it being a survival strategy, which is effectively what it is at the moment. Well, we find in the UK we have about 2,000 mosques here. It's not like Turkey, which has 80,000 or something. We're quite a small community and relatively new, and much of what we do in our places of worship is experimental and provisional. We find that the ideal mosque tends to be one that combines the traditional immutable functions, providing the 5 daily prayers, iftar in Ramadan, weddings, and janazas and so forth, with certain new social functionalities that are particularly important in a society where so many other social hubs are diminishing. And we do find that once that has been understood by mosque management, the number of young people who come tends to increase exponentially. Muslims are only 6% of the national population, but in about 30 years, Islam will be the largest religion in the UK. On the current demographic projections, according to the government website. Sometime about 2050, Islam will be the largest, most widely followed religion in the UK, which is a major responsibility and means that if we're to be Britain's religion in the future, we have to have a coherent leadership, and also we have to have places of worship that are open and forward-looking, rather than just little castles where people from minorities practice incomprehensible private rituals. The function of the mosque really has to open and diversify. So some of the mosques now where younger people are in the driving seat are very active in terms of providing, for instance, during the COVID crisis, they would have vaccination centres. Recently in England, because we have a cost of living crisis, and some people in Cambridge, for instance, can't afford to heat their homes, the Cambridge Mosque has had warm rooms where people of any religion can come along and just get warm. Food distribution to refugees and to other communities. There is a lot of food poverty in the UK, so humanitarian functions tend to come from the mosque. And it tends to be a lot quicker than government response. So for instance, 5 years ago when the famous Grenfell Towers disaster happened in London,
yes, I remember.
the first people there were the people from the mosque and the people from the church. The people from the Belediye, the town hall, didn't get there for 10 hours. So state bureaucracies are slow, but religious communities can move just like that, particularly where there's an immediate humanitarian need. So as we find that social problems sort of increase, need increases, I think that the function of the mosques has to be transformed so that they become centres of social welfare rather than just places of worship and reflection. There is political unity, there is religious unity, there are many forms of unity. The world generally is in a fragmenting state. The main conflict in the world today is the conflict between two kinds of Orthodox Christians in Eastern Europe. The largest conflicts in Africa tend to be the civil wars in Zaire and urban violence in South Africa and elsewhere. Muslim world is not necessarily bottom of the list, I would say, even though the media presentations tend to be negative. But in the longer term, what really counts is the intactness of teachings and practices. Governments come and go. They always come, they always go. But the practices of the religion, if they are kept intact, guarantee the future of that civilization. And we find remarkably in the world of Islam that in our 10 million or so mosques that there are around the world, that we have preserved our core practices intact. That whereas many other religions have been reformed and massively divided, the mosques are united. And recent reports that came from the Pew organization indicate that in most Muslim countries the number of people attending Friday prayers is steadily increasing, despite all of the various problems. So people talk about the crisis of Islam. I'm not so sure that that's a good way of looking at it. The crisis of Islamic politics has always been a disaster. In the Middle Ages, the Islamic world had the Mamluks in Egypt, and it had all kinds of very strange political aberrations. But what really counts in a civilization is its heart. And the heart of the Islamic world is remarkably, you might even say miraculously intact. You go into a church in England, you don't know what you're going to see. Each denomination does something different. Within the denomination, the priest might do, you can't tell. Go into any mosque, I think, anywhere in the world. It might be in a village in Nigeria, it might be the main mosque in Moscow. You can be confident that what you're going to see is the authentic, ancient thing. So the idea of a crisis of the Ummah I don't think is actually true. I think in terms of what really matters, we've managed to hold on to our essential usul, essential principle, by the grace of God, in a quite astonishing manner, which other communities haven't. So I would say that the Ummah is the great success story of the modern world, unless you're looking for how many Teslas a country buys or some stupid criterion. But the Ummah generally is a remarkable capacity to hold on to what really matters in terms of belief, in terms of ritual, family life, care for the aged, preservation of classical values about the home and about gender. So I don't buy these books with titles like The Crisis of Islam and What Went Wrong, the kind of Bernard Lewis problematizing of the Ummah, because I don't think things have gone wrong, except at the superficial politico-economical level, which is of the surface necessarily. But what's deep, I find, in the Ummah is remarkably more successful than any other civilizational zone that I can think of. Well, I've been in Cambridge for most of my life, I suppose, and I've been teaching at the university for more than 20 years now. Cambridge, as well as being home to the university, also is home to a significant number of smaller religious institutions where the different denominations of British Christianity train their priests. So there's 2 Anglican seminaries here. There's a Centre for Catholic Women. There's a Centre for Orthodox Christian Studies. There is a Methodist house. There is a Congregationalist house, a Lutheran house, etc. Everything is here, partly because of the central role that Cambridge has played in the country's religious history. So it seemed fairly obvious to me that there should be a Muslim house as well as part of this mix, particularly since the Muslim population of the country is going up so rapidly, and Muslims tend to be much more observant than members of other communities. The college was established, I suppose, in about the year 2009 and started with a small program just for upgrading the skills of imams. But now it has a fully accredited BA in Islamic studies. We have about 62 full-time students, and we just bought, actually we got the keys today, a neighbouring building which makes us much bigger. So we are growing. We have a strong research profile with some very high-grade research outputs. All of our lecturers have PhDs either from Oxford or Cambridge in Islamic studies, but also have a training in the traditional Sharia disciplines with ijazas and so forth, so they understand both worlds. And we're able to choose some really amazing students, boys and girls from the British Muslim community. We've had a few Turkish students as well, but they're mostly British. So it's a very interesting kind of laboratory in which we experiment with various formulas in terms of the curriculum, which is still being processed, in order to try and create an intellectual leadership and a mosque leadership that will be able to deal with the various challenges that face this growing, successful religious community in Britain in the decades to come. Well, students who come expect it to be a degree in Islamic studies, so their expectation is that they learn about Quranic interpretation, about tafsir, about the hadiths, the ulum al-Quran, the sciences of the Quran, the traditional madrasa curriculum, but not in a rote learning or a reiterative way, but in a way that's more analytical and understands the historical context in which those sciences develop. But also with a very strong emphasis on looking at contemporary challenges, contemporary insights. So they do a lot of work on modern philosophy. And in fact, the most popular option for the previous cohort of students after they graduated was that they wanted to go on to do master's degrees in philosophy. Mm-hmm. Not even philosophy, but philosophy. Most of them went to UCL, University College London, where they got into the master's program, and they'll be hopefully good philosophers.
Sure.
Yeah, so it's a kind of elite institution. We don't take anybody, and we interview them very carefully, and we generally choose those who are religiously serious but intellectually open and like to be challenged. It's not the kind of Islamic institution where people go in order to be safe from the challenges of the modern world. It's rather the opposite. We say, what about evolution? What about the Big Bang? What about artificial intelligence? And say you have to think about or be exposed to what Muslims are thinking about these issues. Otherwise, you're just going to be a kind of refugee hiding from modern challenges that people are asking about. So it's not a comfort zone for Muslims at all. It's a place where we engage with the big questions of the modern age. Well, necessarily, given the challenges that modernity throws at religion, which are greater than the challenges which the Ummah has ever faced before, there will be a range of responses, some of which are emotional and defensive, others are aggressive and offensive, and you see a huge range of different strategies for dealing with modernity across the Muslim world, including radical forms of fundamentalism of a kind that have hardly been seen before in our heritage, like Taliban, ISIS, Al-Qaeda. This is kind of a new thing that to us seems to be an expression of panic rather than a serious reflection on how you successfully deal with modern challenges. At the other end, you have various defeatist strategies that say, oh, the modern world is triumphant and therefore we need to become like it and get on board with the ideology of progress. Modern theories about gender and desire, the family, we have to accept that because that's inevitable, as if one was facing some kind of ice age and just had to adapt to that. But intellectual tendencies are not like natural phenomena. And generally, looking at the world religions, for instance, in the Catholic Church, the churches that are most popular amongst young people are the very traditional churches, not those that are making a lot of concessions and modernising the liturgy and modernising their teaching. So if you go to a Catholic church where the service is in English and they have very modern ideas about society, you'll only see old people, for sure. If you go to the places where they do the traditional Latin Mass and the priest is dressed up in the lace and the hat and the whole performance and incense, that's where you'll see the young people. So if you want to attract the young in the modern context, I think, at least in the West, in the Muslim world where people are looking at modernity from a distance and still a bit dazzled by it. They think, wow, this is something really successful. We have to have the sense that we're defeated by it or we have to copy it. Here in the West, we're very well aware of the challenges and problems of modernity, that most of the threats that face humanity nowadays are the result of science and technology. And so we're perhaps a little bit more mature, and we can present very orthodox and continuity-based forms of Islam in a way that really attract the brightest minds and the most interested and adventurous and independently thinking young people.
Ketebe'nin katkılarıyla hazırlanan Düşünce Atlası sona erdi.